He works at a federal college in the United Arab Emirates, where he teaches in the General Studies Department. He did his honors year at the University of the Witwatersrand and his master's degree at the University of South Africa, which is how we became connected. His master's dissertation focused on determining authorship on Facebook. He is now in his third year of his doctorate at the University of Exeter, where he's researching the language of right-wing extremism and how it impacts educational institutions. Sadly, and at least he can share with us, he only gets to do forensic linguistics on a freelance basis. But he did have the pleasure of helping Graham Joff, who's actually on the call, on the webinar, so we hope to see him later. And that's when Graham was defamed on a website. In his free time, Colin practices Muay Thai boxing and very impressively is an enthusiastic vegan chef. So Colin, thank you so much. I'm going to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Maxine, for that kind introduction. So really what we'll be talking about today is, this is really going to be an overview of forensic linguistics. It's mostly for people who have never done it before, or they've heard about it, seen it on CSI, or they've read about it in like some form of linguistic, some sort of linguistic materials and want to know a little bit more. So it's going to be very much on the surface. And as we know, today is about practical aspects. So every now and then, so sometimes I've got a few things here where we can do some things from the real world of forensic linguistics, and we can look at how we can apply them practically. And I'll also like to just talk a little bit about one of the cases I worked on, which was the Graham Joffe case. So let me just do my next slide. Okay, so I think for a start, maybe we should just start by having a look at what forensic linguistics is. I quite like the definition that was given by Dr. John Olson, who says forensic linguistics is the application of linguistics to legal issues. I like that one because it's sort of all-encompassing. It gives the idea that anytime the language and the law have collided with each other, that's where we come in. It's a very broad church. As we can see now, I mean, forensic linguistics could encompass things such as authorship attribution, which I will talk about later. Plagiarism, something that's actually quite important to me, and this is where I actually get to use a lot of my forensic linguistic knowledge. As I'm a teacher at a college, we often have students who hand in work, which is sometimes not entirely their own work. And, you know, so I've learned ways of how to actually find out if what they've done is their own, or if it's been, or they've had help, or if they've lifted it straight from the internet. Suicide notes do come into it. It's, and which we want to get to. And then there's also like courtroom language is a big deal in forensic linguistics, and this is where it really helps people. Now, if you can look on my screen, I have a thing from the Australian Aborigines. I mean, forensic linguistics has been used quite a lot in places like Australia, where the Aboriginal people have had trouble in the courts over land disputes, and mainly because they didn't understand the language of the court. So part of our job is to try to find out how they can understand what's happening in the court better, and what they are understanding. And one I would like to talk about over here is also falls in a lot, is that is trademark disputes. The example I'd like to give you is McDonald's. In about 1987, McDonald's took a company called McSleep to court over the use of the Mc, the MC. McSleep claimed it was part of their Scottish heritage, they could use it. McDonald's said no, that they actually owned the trade right to the Mc, as they'd been spending years promoting it with things like McFries, McFish, McShakes, Here in the UAE, for example, I've seen Arabia burgers all over the place, and they actually did win the case against it. So now it's almost impossible for anybody to put the MC in front of any of their company names or anything they want to do. Interestingly, that did bounce back against them, as environmentalists, animal rights people then coined the terms McMurder, McDeforestation, and even now McDonald's are trying to convince major dictionaries to remove the term McJob from their lexicon. McJob, of course, meaning a job which is very low paid, low status. So these are just some ideas. I think what is important to look at is what forensic linguistics isn't. Firstly, it's not handwriting analysis. I have been asked a few times by people, particularly at the college, can I analyze their handwriting? And the fact of the matter is no. Forensic linguistics is purely about the language, the linguistics. We'll leave the handwriting analysis, I think, to the psychologists. It's also not about what the person's motive is. And on the previous slide, I mentioned suicide notes, and this is where things can actually become a little bit difficult, is where there may be a temptation to actually delve into the motive behind it rather than just looking at the linguistics of it. So the two things that I think it's quite important to emphasize, that forensic linguistics doesn't do handwriting analysis, and we don't look at motivations. We're purely what is the language being used. Next one. Yeah, let's just give a very quick overview of just a very quick history lesson of just some of the these are just some of the main forensic linguistic cases that have happened just over the few years that have actually reached the media. Some have been on TV, and some have even been the topic of a television series. One that is quite interesting is the Da Vinci Code. Dan Brown was taken to court by the writers of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and it actually held up the making of the film for quite a long time, as they claimed Dan Brown had stolen the entire main theme of Holy Blood, Holy Grail and used it in his book. But to go back to where actually, and the Evans statement is probably one of the most important. This is where actually forensic linguistics as a term was first coined, really. In 1968, a linguist by the name of Jan Svartvik analyzed the statements from what is commonly known as the Evans statements. Timothy Evans, he was convicted of murdering his wife and his baby daughter, and I believe he was also then sentenced to death. But what it transpired is that when they looked at his the transcript of his police statement, they found a lot of inconsistencies. They found a lot of stuff had been added in by the police that was not his own words. What should have been a verbatim statement had a lot of police addings into it, and based on that, and so this is where forensic linguistics as a term came into being, because Jan Svartvik analyzed this and worked out which was the police the police speak and which was Timothy Evans stuff. Similar to that was the Derek Bentley case, which came up in the 1950s. Two teenagers, Derek Bentley and his friend, who was 19 at the time, his friend Chris Craig, who was 16, were breaking into a warehouse. The police confronted them, shots were fired, but although it wasn't, and eventually I think Derek Bentley was arrested and basically sentenced to death for it. Again, this was a problem with the statement that had been issued to the police, in that Inside the statement that was quite worrying, it was what should have been a verbatim statement included a lot of police terms, particularly the one, I then went, Chris then went. The construction of putting the then after the subject was very much a police register, and that was inside what should have been a verbatim statement. And then, of course, for anyone who's watched Netflix, would know about the Unabomber. Between 1978 and 1995, a chap who went by the name of FC, about once a year, sent a bomb through the post, usually to the universities or the airlines, and this went on for a while. And he basically said he would stop if his 35,000 word manuscript, Industrial Society and Its Future, was published. And how they managed to find him was within that manuscript was the term cool-headed logician, which is something which only he really used. And I believe it was his brother that alerted the FBI to that. It was also added to the fact that prior to that, there was about a 300-word statement released into the press, which included 12 terms, which were then found all 12 of them were back into the manuscript. And I believe this is how the FBI managed to track down the Unabomber. As today is really about sort of practical applications and what linguists do, I thought I'd like to add this one in. I'm actually adding this one more for our American friends here. It concerns the Miranda warnings. So I'm just going to play this and see if it works.
Miranda writes, or warning, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney during interrogation. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you.
Okay. Now, I'm sure everybody's familiar with that. We've all watched enough police shows to have seen that. Now, what's happened since over the years, many academic studies have been done on the Miranda rights, particularly whether or not the Miranda rights are actually understood by second language speakers and even first language speakers. And over the years, it's been quite consistent that even first language speakers do not understand the Miranda rights. What I have up in front of you now is the topic of a research report, which was in actually the latest edition of the International Journal of Speech, Language and the Law. And it's really saying, it come to the same conclusion as the 1997 Dr. Roger Shoy's paper, that people still do not understand, and especially second language speakers do not understand the content of the Miranda rights. So I've been reading about these for a few years, and I've also been thinking, like, just from a purely practical perspective. And again, I'm looking at our American friends, especially our American friends who are in education, particularly if you're in TESOL or ESL. This could be a good opportunity to create worksheets and materials that could actually help second language speakers to understand the Miranda rights, especially now, as we can see, the US does have large numbers of mostly Spanish-speaking immigrants coming in. So I think this is one practical way that a forensic linguistic research can then take the next step to a practical level. So the bit I'd like to get onto now really is about the sort of authorship attribution. And if I could just give this quote here, is how reliably can linguistic experts establish that person A wrote document X when document X is an email? or worse, a terse note sent by instant message or Twitter. After all, emails and the ilk give us so much more purchase on an author's idiosyncrasies than an extended work of literature. Does digital writing leave fingerprints? So this is one of the issues that come up nowadays, is a lot of the writing that needs to be analyzed is writing that is done online. And as Zimmer said, yeah, it could just be a Twitter, as you can see from, it could just be a blog. Sometimes it's just, especially now with WhatsApp. And that doesn't leave an awful lot of material to work with. I do like, I feel I just should mention this over here, leave fingerprints. One term that is heard every now and then is the term the linguistic fingerprint. It's a lovely metaphor for CSI and other cop shows, but unfortunately it doesn't really work in the real world. To the best of my knowledge, there really isn't a computer yet that could highlight one single person's writing out of everybody in the whole world. So even though we've called it forensic linguistics, it's probably not as precise as, say, fingerprinting or DNA analysis, or was it blood splatter analysis? Right. Now, what I have in front of me here is, so what I'd like to look at is, before I get to the case that I'd like to discuss, is what, we're going to have a look at what makes one person's writing unique. And we have a term called style markers. Style markers would be anything that would make one person's writing different to another's, different things that we do. I'm going to use, oh, by the way, this one I have here now was actually on my Facebook wall this week. They're all friends of mine, and they've all graciously allowed me to use their probably quite embarrassing Facebook post. So before I continue, for the people who are not in the UAE, Carrefour is basically a large sort of a supermarket, probably the same as the South African Pick and Pay or the UK Tesco's. And let's just look at what we have for here. We can actually see that the original poster here has got O and then exclamation mark and another exclamation mark. Nothing unusual about that, but you know, one could say it could be unusual that they would have O exclamation mark straight away from there. Why not just O and then carry on, or O comma? So that could put this on. If we move down to the next one, you can see there's a rather interesting use of punctuation, where we would have a exclamation mark and a question mark together. And then, oh, okay, yeah. And then if you look, okay, this is actually one of my responses. What I've highlighted there, and you probably notice, is that I neglected to put a full stop there. And I've realized that that is actually something I do quite often, and so do quite a few people, to the point that I think it actually has become a style marker on its own, when people either end the sentence with a full stop, or sometimes they don't. And then we look at the response, and we can see a few interesting style markers. The use of emojis. One could ask, why did she choose that one? Is it being used at the end of a sentence? You'll see that there's like 2 dots over there. Was that deliberate? Is that normal from her writing or not? We could look at that. Again, we have another emoji. So these emojis are starting to set her apart. And then what's also quite interesting, yeah, we've got brackets, but she's put her adverb within the brackets. So that could be something that this writer does habitually, and it'd be something to look for, the use of bracketed adverbs. Okay, so these are some style markers. So what I'd like you to do is, I'm actually going to give you 2 minutes in a moment, and what I'd like you to do is, I'd like you to reflect on your own writing, okay? Maybe imagine you're about to commit a crime of some sort and you're about to send an email to that effect, but you don't want to get caught. You need to analyze your writing to see what you do that could set you apart. So, for example, how long do you think your sentences are? I know for myself, I tend to use very short, pithy sentences. Do you use any particular words habitually? I know for myself, I'm quite fond of throwing so in a lot and jolly. Do you have any idiosyncratic uses of function words? Function words being things like in, on, the, etc. Words like that, sort of the grammar words. They don't really do anything. They just hold the sentences together. Do you have any punctuation usage that you favor? Maybe you like multiple question marks or question mark full exclamation mark. Emojis, do you use them? Which one? Where do you use them? I know for myself, I like to end a sentence with an emoji rather than a full stop sometimes. And then also, do you habitually code switch? Perhaps you speak another language and you throw words in from that into your writing. I'd like you to think, probably better if you just think of your informal writing, the sort of writing you would do on Facebook, WhatsApp. Think of that. If I could give everybody just 2 minutes to think about that. We're not going to get feedback. By thinking about it, it would just help us with the next bit where I want to describe my case. It'll make it a bit clearer. Okay, your 2 minutes will start now. Okay, great. Let's go back. Okay, I was just having a quick look in the chat. I can see people were thinking about their writing. I find that's it's a very interesting task. Before you're going to analyze somebody else's writing, maybe it's always a good idea just to look at your own, about what makes your own writing so unique. And I've been pleasantly and unpleasantly surprised about my own sometimes. But now let's have a look at how we had a practical application of this. Now, this is where I'd like to, this was a case I had the privilege of working on a few years ago. This is South Africa's very own Graham Joffe. A few years ago, Graham was, just to give the background, Graham is a sports presenter and somebody who basically is a journalist for sport, and he had spoke on radio and things like that, but he also spent time sort of investigating corruption within South African sport. Just for the benefit for the people not from South Africa, corruption in South African sport at the top is unbelievably bad. There's loads of money up there. There's a lot of money going through, but absolutely nothing gets down to the players and the sports people. And there's a lot of people basically making themselves very rich off it. Graham Joffe exposed many of these people. They turned the heat up on him, and he was essentially forced to flee South Africa back to the US, where I believe he is living now, and where he continues to report on corruption in sport in South Africa. But what made this interesting was Graham found himself at the mercy of a defamatory blog. Some people put out a blog on this website. It has been taken down now. I checked again today. The IP address was in London, but the server was in Panama. So no matter how hard they tried, they could not get this website taken down. Essentially, it had 4 articles defaming Graham. So it was just, and it was all written between 2014 and 2015. Apart from that, let's go back to it. This is an example of a tweet Graham received where they were trying to blackmail him, telling him that that they had a dossier on him and that would come out if he behave himself. I think by behave himself, they meant was stop looking at what we are doing. These were the topics of the blog. You can see this thing, amateur Joffe embarrassed on Twitter, Hambagachle, for the non-South Africans, that's basically goodbye in Zulu. High Court slams Graham Joffe. The last one, who is Graham Joffe's deep throat, who is picking up Graham Joffe's bills. All of these were short extracts or excerpts slamming the character of Graham Joffe. And so what I'd like to give you now is there are some of the examples from this, from the deflammatory blog, so you can get an idea of what sort of stuff was being written about Mr. Joffe, and what can be more embarrassing than being called out by one of your own. Graham Joffe once again showed why he's been fired from just about every journalism's job he's ever had. Now, don't get the wrong idea here. No, we're not talking about the extra services Joffe regularly receives upstairs at Teasers. Teasers, for those not in South Africa, is essentially a stripper's bar. And then Graham was accused of having a gambling addiction, and then they also then disparaged or cast aspersions on just whether or not he was being patriotic or not, and joking about the fact that he had to leave. So these were the sorts of things that were essentially making Graham's life difficult. And the thing is, we needed to find out who was responsible for this. I want to return to that in a moment. My problem was, this was like a blog or a website, and now we had a few suspects. I asked Graham, and obviously he had a small list of people whom he suspected were behind this. They were all journalists from a few major sporting magazines in South Africa, who were all owned under the same publishing house. And there was quite a lot of bad blood between Graham and these journalists. So those were our prime suspects. Now, our problem was it was a blog. And obviously one prefers to compare like with like. And none of the suspects actually wrote a blog. So I had nothing to, so I couldn't compare a blog they had written with this blog, because they didn't have any. I couldn't compare their journalistic work to the blog, simply because we're looking at two completely different registers. And for anyone who's worked in journalism will know that you have a specific style that you have to abide by. So the language would be different to what they would normally use. So what I did decide to do was to try to find out if they had put anything out online, anything else online, usually like Twitter or Facebook. All of them had their Facebook profiles locked down tight, so I couldn't get any of those. But I was able to access their Twitter accounts. Well, Twitter is public anyway. That's the whole point of Twitter, is that it's your public views. So I mined Twitter for the language they use. For what they had. And what I soon realized when I looked at the blog, that even though we had a group of suspects, it probably wasn't only one person writing this blog. There was definitely a possibility of multiple authorships. And if I can just go back to the previous slide, let's just have a look at them. I've taken two. Now, I would say that the first two are written by one person, and the second two are probably written by another person. What gives me that idea is if you can look over here, it's the same use of like the multiple exclamation marks. It's borderline histrionic, some of this, and but if you look at the second one, we'll notice that, and you'll notice that there's the use of the commas over here. He's actually separated things with commas, whereas in the first one here, it's a long, drawn-out sentence. There's no commas in any of them. And yeah, he's got quite good use of them in both of them, but without the usual exclamation marks. Now, I'm well aware of the fact that these are journalists. And as journalists, they obviously can write, and they probably can change the way they're writing all the time. So they probably could, one person could easily create multiple styles simply because they are journalists. So I had to work with that. So at first I treated the whole blog as one person just to see what came out. And before we continue, so we had the blog, which was 2,670 words. That's all it was in it, which is enough. And then we had our 3 potential authors of this blog. So I managed to get, from their Twitter accounts, I managed to get 3,252 words of text from our suspect 1, 2,549 from suspect 2, and 2,776 words from suspect 3. Please remember that in Twitter, you can only have 140 characters. So it really took quite a while to get enough words to be able to compare against the blog. My first port of call was I wanted to do a stylometric analysis. This is really, well, it's basically a little bit of statistics. What I did was I took out the first 24 most commonly occurring words in the blog. And you pretty much put in under X, this is the blog. And I said how many times the was used, how many times to was used, of all those words, how many times the blog had them. And then I did the same for each of the suspects. We started with 6. This was eventually brought down to 3. I removed words from the blog like Joffers or Graham because they really wouldn't come into because they really just wouldn't fit the others. What is interesting, you'll notice here, pretty much all the words here are just function words. They're just, there's no content words at all, which in itself was quite interesting. And once I'd done that, I basically counted them for each, I went to each corpus so my suspect 1 had, oops, wrong one. So for example, suspect 1 had 3,252 words. And of that, I think this one actually, he had 88 thers and 29 twos. So I had to see if they're using the same sort of, say, if the blog was 100, then maybe I should be close to 100, that sort of thing, for all 24. And then at the bottom, I got a p-value from doing a chi-square analysis, but it didn't really produce very much. The highest was 0.33. To be more accurate, it probably should have been closer to 1, like a 0.9 or 0.88. That would be more conclusive. And to me, this sort of showed that it probably was a case of multiple authorships. And for that reason, I decided it would probably be better to do a stylistic analysis where I would go through the blog and look for unique features, kind of like what I showed you on the Facebook page before. And being a blog, one of the things that came out quite a lot, and this is common in very informal languages, especially punctuation. People have a lot of fun with punctuation. So on the blog, I was looking for all the different and unique sort of punctuation features, because that's what really abounds. So we had things like multiple exclamation marks, multiple question marks, few times with a few double quotes, use of brackets, hyphens, capitalization. These are fairly standard, and well, particularly these ones would be quite standard. Capitalizations wasn't. But the ones that really did stand out that were quite unusual is if you have capitalization and then some question mark, exclamation marks. And sometimes we've got like a word, as we have here, with no space and then elliptical dots. That's quite an unusual construction. So, so when I looked, these were all from the blog. So then I needed to find the same features inside my suspect's Twitter accounts. And when we looked at that, we could see from the website we had all of these. The multiple exclamation marks actually were actually quite common with, well, they were only really common with one. Actually, I probably should have added in there as well. The other two didn't really do it, or I can't actually, so it's covering my screen there. Multiple question marks as well is quite unusual. But then we come down to the ones that were quite interesting. The capitalization plus exclamation marks. The website had an example of 3 of them, and my one suspect had the same construction in there. The same suspect also had the one where it was word with no space, then elliptical dots, as we can see, 3 A's, and then dots. So the thought was the most likely suspect from all of them would be the person that had these. So the conclusion I got to from all of that was, because capitalization plus exclamation marks, word plus no space together are very unusual, but to have both of them in one, as part of one author, basically points to the fact that that's my first suspect, I don't want to say that, was possibly one of the authors of the defamatory blog. Coming back to the linguistic fingerprint we had earlier, it's very difficult. Like I said, this is not DNA, this is not blood splatter analysis. It's very difficult to say for absolute certainty with languages. So it would be, so I put it in as the suspect 1 was possibly one of the authors of the defamatory blog. And I think Graham was quite happy with that analysis. So I'd like to move on from that. And I've actually put this in as a practical thing. And this is where I'm actually going to leave it over to you, actually, the audience. This is something I'd like you to think about at home. You can feel free to email me with thoughts on this afterwards if you want. All right, so what we had in South Africa was Chicken Licken, which is a very large fried chicken company, took a vegan restaurant, Oh My Soul, to court over the use of the term soul. Chicken Licken claimed that Oh My Soul was capitalizing on, well, it was basically piggybacking on their brand by using the word soul. And Oh My Soul obviously believed that, well, they don't. Thankfully, the court in Durban ruled that Chicken Licken really had no case on this, and agreed with the Oh My Soul vegan restaurant. But this gave me a lot of thought, because now we have the word soul. So what I would like you to think about, and again, if it hadn't gone that way, and if you were asked to solve this dilemma, how would you do it? What would you do with the word soul that could show why either one of them should have won the case. And that's really what I'd like you to think about. I am now open to taking questions. Thank you. I'd like to just point out, Graham, who's with us, has since said that he's confirmed that the chief suspect that I highlighted was indeed the author of the defamatory blog. Graham, would you maybe like to come in here and explain how that happened?
It was confirmed by two different people. Again, I just wanted to thank you. I owe you a huge debt of gratitude for what you did. You went and took on the project, took it on for free, and really helped me. It gave me closure. And writing the book was the best psychotherapy I could have. But just confirming and knowing that these guys were the actual suspects, even though I probably knew 90% of the time that these were the guys, it's always good to see it in writing and fascinating. Forensic linguistics is something I never even thought about until my good friend Lindy approached you and you agreed to take on the job. I studied Linguistics 1 at university. I think I've learned more in the last 45 minutes than I learned in a whole year. So thanks once again.
Cool. No, thanks, Graham. I'm glad I could help. Okay. Somebody's asked on how to become a forensic linguist. Okay. It's probably best if you do study it. Sorry, that sounds a bit silly. Yes, you do have to study it. There are a few places in the world where you can do it. The UK and the US are probably your two best bets at the moment. In the UK, there's Aston University, the Centre for Forensic Linguistics, really good. Cardiff University would also be a good choice. I'm not sure if I'm saying this correctly, Bognor Regis in Northern Wales. I think Dr. John Olson is there. Also good. And then in the US, if you want to do it online, there's California University of Pennsylvania. They would be a good choice. I'm a little hazy on anything else in the US, I'm sorry. But so if you are keen on that, those are probably your best choices.
Colin, the next question further down is from Unati, and she asks if one should also study criminology or law or anything along those lines if you want to go into forensic linguistics.
Actually, that's what I did want to mention. Probably because work for a full-time forensic linguist is, well, it's limited unless something happens. So you probably would do this in conjunction, I think, with studying law. Or people are studying law, people in law enforcement, journalists would probably benefit from a semester or two of forensic linguistics. Okay, Celeste, how much of your work involves statistical analysis? I have used it with authorship attribution. Personally, I'm more keen on stylistics rather than stylometry, but that's just my personal taste. I know there are some very well-known forensic linguists, particularly in the States, who say only the stylometric or the statistics is valid and the stylistics isn't. But for me, yes, I think using the stylometric together with the stylistics is probably the best way to do this. Someone asked, how do alternative spellings and typos affect the stylistic analysis of online Twitter, Facebook? Typos are quite interesting because maybe people make the same sort of typos all the time. What is interesting now with, especially now that so much of this has gone online, is that you can almost, if it's written on computer, we can almost ignore spelling because there's all the spell checks. Which makes analyzing spelling quite difficult. But alternative spellings is an interesting one because if I think about myself, for instance, I'm fanatical about using the British variant of the words to the point that I'll go back through even WhatsApp texts and make sure I put the U in color. So if I had done something wrong and somebody was trying to look at my writing style, that would be something they could pick up on. Okay. Someone's asked, do you think the words used by an author can have an effect or effect of his mental stability, thought, and psychological aspect. Okay, now that's one of the things we mentioned at the beginning is, as a forensic linguist, we don't look at motive. Unless we have a degree in psychology, we should not be commenting on motive or the mental state of somebody. That is outside of our expertise, unless we have a degree in psychology. Now there's an interesting one. To be a forensic linguist, does one need a PhD? Well, I suppose the answer to this would be yes and no. I'm working on my doctorate at the moment. I am aware that in some countries, to be admitted as an expert witness in court, one does need a doctorate. I believe that applies specifically to the US. I could be wrong on that. But I think to answer your question, it's probably best to work towards one.
Thank you very much, Colin. I think based on the chat, everyone has really learned a lot, myself included. And especially since you gave a real life application, I think that will go a long way to help us understanding the discipline. So just from myself and the Department of Linguistics and Modern Languages at UNISA, thank you very much